Chapter 18. Interview with a Child. The Chief Constable of Winshire looked in at Kyle Manor the next morning, just at the right time for a glass of Madeira and a biscuit.
"Sorry to trouble you over this affair, Zellaby. Ghastly business, perfectly horrible. Can't make any sense of it. Nobody in your village quite on target, seems to me. Thought you might be able to put up a picture a fellow can understand."
Angela leant forward. "What are the real figures, Sir John? We've heard nothing officially yet."
"Bad, I'm afraid." He shook his head. 1 woman and 3 men dead. 8 men and 5 women in hospital. 2 of the men and 1 woman in a pretty bad way. Several men who aren't in hospital look as if they ought to be. Regular riot, by all accounts. Everybody fighting everybody else. But why? That's what I can't get at. No sense out of anybody.
He turned back to Zellaby.
"Seeing that you called the police and told them there was going to be trouble, it'd help us to know what put you onto it." "Well," Zellaby began cautiously, "it's a curious situation."
His wife cut him short by breaking in. "It was Mrs. Brant, the blacksmith's wife," she said, and went on to describe the vicar's departure. "I'm sure Mr. Leabody will be able to tell you more than we can. He was there, you see, we weren't."
"He was there, all right, and got home somehow, but now he's in train hospital," said the Chief Constable.
"Oh, poor Mr. Leabody. Is he badly hurt?"
"I'm afraid I don't know. The doctor there tells me he's not to be disturbed for a bit. Now," he turned back to Zellaby once more, "you told my people that a crowd was marching on the Grange, with the intention of setting fire to it. What was your source of information?"
Zellaby looked surprised.
"Why, Mrs. Brant, my wife, just told you." "Is that all? You didn't go out to see for yourself what was going on?" No," Zellaby admitted. "You mean that, on the unsupported word of a woman in a semi-hysterical condition, you called out the police, in force, and told them that ambulances would be needed?"
"I insisted on it," Angela told him with a touch of chill, "and I was perfectly right. They were needed."
"But simply on this woman's word?"
"I've known Mrs. Brant for years. She's a sensible woman."
Bernard put in, "If Mrs. Zellaby had not advised us against going to see for ourselves, I'm quite sure we should now be either in hospital or worse."
The Chief Constable looked at us.
"I've had an exhausting night," he said at last. "Perhaps I haven't got this straight. What you seem to be saying is that this Mrs. Brant came here and told you that the villagers, perfectly ordinary English men and women and good Winshire stock, were intending to march on a school full of children. Their own children, too, and—"
"Not quite, Sir John. The men were going to march, and perhaps some of the women, but I think most of the women would be against it."
Angela objected. "Very well. These men, then, ordinary, decent country chaps, were going to set fire to a school full of children. You didn't question it? You accepted an incredible thing like that at once? You didn't try to check up or see for yourselves what was happening? You just called in the police because Mrs. Brant is a sensible woman?"
"Yes,"
Angela said icily. "Sir John," Zellaby said with equal coolness, "I realize you have been up all night, and I appreciate your official position, but I think that if this interview is to continue, it must be upon different lines."
The Chief Constable went a little pink. His gaze dropped. Presently he massaged his forehead vigorously with a large fist. He apologized first to Angela and then to Zellaby. Almost pathetically, he said, "But there's nothing to get hold of. I've been asking questions for hours, and I can't make head or tail of anything. There's no sign that these people were trying to burn the Grange. They never touched it. They were simply fighting one another. Men, and a few women, too, but they were doing it in the Grange grounds. Now, why? It wasn't just the women trying to stop the men, or it seems some of the men trying to stop the rest. No, it appears they all went up from the pub to the Grange together, with nobody trying to stop anybody except the parson, whom they wouldn't listen to, and a few women who backed him up. And what was it all about? Something, apparently, to do with the children at the school.
But what sort of reason is that for a riot like this? It just doesn't make sense. Any of it." He shook his head and ruminated a moment. "I remember my predecessor, old Bodger, saying there was something deuced funny about Midwich, and by God he was right. But what is it?" "It seems to me that the best we can do is to refer you to Colonel Westcott," suggested Zellaby, indicating Bernard. With a slightly malicious touch, he added, "His department, for a reason which has continued to elude me for 9 years, preserves a continuing interest in Midwich, so that he probably knows more about us than we do ourselves." Sir John turned his attention to Bernard. "And what is your department, sir?" he inquired. At Bernard's reply, his eyes bulged slightly. He looked like a man wishing to be given strength. "Did you say military intelligence?" he inquired flatly. "Yes, sir," said Bernard. The chief constable shook his head. "I give up." He looked back at Zellaby, with the expression of one only 2 or 3 straws from the end. "And now military intelligence," he muttered. About the same time that the chief constable had arrived at Kyle Manor, one of the children, a boy, came walking unhurriedly down the drive of the Grange. 2 policemen who were chatting at the gate broke off their conversation. One of them turned and strolled to meet the boy. "And where will you be off to, son?" he inquired, amiably enough. The boy looked at the policeman without expression, though the curious golden eyes were alert. "Into the village," he said. "Better if you didn't," advised the policeman. "They're not feeling too friendly there about your lot. Not after last night, they're not." But the boy neither answered nor checked his walk. He simply kept on. The policeman turned and walked back towards the gate. His colleague looked at him curiously. "Lummy," he said. "Didn't make much of a job of that, did you? Thought the idea was to persuade him to keep out of harm's way." The first policeman looked after the boy going on down the lane, with a puzzled expression. He shook his head. "Funny that," he said uneasily. "I don't get it. If there's another, you have a try, Bert." A minute or 2 later, one of the girls appeared. She, too, was walking in a casually confident way. "Right," said the second policeman. "Just a bit of advice. Fatherly-like, see?" He began to stroll towards the girl. After perhaps 4 steps, he turned round and came back again. The 2 policemen, standing side by side, watched her walk past them and into the lane. She never even glanced at them. "What the hell?" asked the second policeman in a baffled voice. "Bit off, isn't it?" said the other. "You go to do something, and then you do something else instead. I don't reckon I like it much. Hey!" he called after the girl. "Hey, you, missy!" The girl did not look back. He started in pursuit, covered 6 yards, and then stopped dead. The girl passed out of sight round the corner of the lane. The policeman relaxed, turned round, and came back. He was breathing rather fast, and had an uneasy look on his face. "I definitely don't like it," he said unhappily. "There's something kind of funny about this place." The bus from Opley, on its way to train via Stouch, stopped in Midwich, opposite Mrs. Welt's shop. The 10 or dozen women waiting for it allowed the 2 offloading passengers to descend, and then moved forward in a ragged queue. Miss Latterly, at its head, took hold of the rail, and made to step aboard. Nothing further happened. Both her feet appeared to be glued to the ground. "Hurry along there, please," said the conductor. Miss Latterly tried again, with no better success. She looked up helplessly at the conductor. "Just you stand aside and let him get on, ma'am. I'll give you a hand in a minute," he advised her. Miss Latterly, looking bewildered, took his advice. Mrs. Dorry moved up to take her place and grasped the rail. She, too, failed to get any further. The conductor reached down to take her arm and pull her up, but her foot would not lift to the step. She moved beside Miss Latterly, and they both watched the next in turn make an equally fruitless attempt to get aboard. "What's this, some kind of joke?" inquired the conductor. Then he saw the expression on the faces of the 3. "Sorry, ladies, no offence, But what's the trouble?"
It was Miss Latterly who, turning her attention from the fourth woman's ineffective approach to the bus, noticed one of the children. He was sitting casually on the mounting block opposite the scythe and stone, with his face turned towards them, and one leg idly swinging. She detached herself from the group by the bus and walked towards him. She studied him carefully as she approached. Even so, it was with a touch of uncertainty, she said, "You're not Joseph, are you?" The boy shook his head. She went on, "I want to go to train to see Miss Forsham, Joseph's mother. She was hurt last night. She's in the hospital there." The boy kept on looking at her. He shook his head very slightly. Tears of anger came into Miss Latterly's eyes. "Haven't you done enough harm? You're monsters. All we want to do is go and see our friends who've been hurt because of what you did." The boy said nothing. Miss Latterly took an impulsive half-step towards him, then checked herself. "Don't you understand? Haven't you any human feelings?" she said in a shaking voice. Behind her, the conductor, half puzzled, half jocular, was saying,
"Come along now, ladies, make up your minds. The old bus don't bite, you know. Can't wait here all day."
The group of women stood irresolute, some of them looking frightened. Mrs. Dorry made one more attempt to board the bus. It was no use. Two of the women turned to glare angrily at the boy, who looked back at them unmoved. Miss Latterly turned helplessly and began to walk away. The conductor's temper shortened.
"Well, if you're not coming, we're off. Got our times to keep, you know."
None of the group made any move. He hit the bell decisively, and the bus moved on. The conductor gazed at them as they dwindled forlornly behind, and shook his head. As he ambled forward to exchange comments with the driver, he muttered to himself the local adage, "In Upley they're smart, and in Stouch they're smarmy, but Midwich folk are just plain balmy." Polly Rushton, her uncle's invaluable right hand in the parish ever since she had fled across the unmended breach between the two families, was driving Mrs. Leabody into train to see the vicar. His injuries in the fracas, the hospital had telephoned reassuringly, were uncomfortable, but not serious. Only a fracture of the left radius, a broken right clavicle, and a number of contusions, but he was in need of rest and quiet. He would be glad of a visit in order to make some arrangements to cover his absence. 200 yards out of Midwich, however, Polly braked abruptly, and started to turn the car about. "What have we forgotten?" inquired Mrs. Leabody in surprise. "Nothing," Polly told her. "I just can't go on, that's all." "Can't?" repeated Mrs. Leabody. "Can't," said Polly. "Well, really," said Mrs. Leabody, "I should have thought that at a time like this—" "Aunt Dora, I said can't, not won't." "I don't understand what you're talking about," said Mrs. Leabody. "All right," said Polly. She drove on a few yards and turned the car again so that it faced away from the village once more. "Now change places, and you try," she told her. Unwillingly, Mrs. Leabody took the driving seat. She didn't care for driving, but accepted the challenge. They moved forward again, and at precisely the spot where Polly had braked, Mrs. Leabody braked. There came the sound of a horn behind them, and a tradesman's van with a train dress on it squeezed by. They watched it vanish round the corner ahead. Mrs. Leabody attempted to reach the accelerator pedal, but her foot stopped short of it. She tried again. Her foot still could not get to it. Polly looked round and saw one of the children sitting half-hidden in the hedge, watching them. She looked harder at the girl, making sure which one it was. "Judy?" Polly said, with sudden misgiving. "Is it you doing this?" The girl's nod was barely perceptible. "But you mustn't," Polly protested. "We want to go to train to see Uncle Hubert. He was hurt. He's in hospital." "You can't go," the girl told her with a faintly apologetic inflection. "But, Judy, he has to arrange lots of things with me for the time he'll have to be away." The girl simply shook her head, slowly. Polly felt her temper rising. She drew breath to speak again, but Mrs. Leabody cut in nervously. "Don't annoy her, Polly. Wasn't last night enough of a lesson for all of us?" Her advice went home. Polly said no more. She sat glaring at the child in the hedge, with a muddle of frustrated emotion that brought tears of resentment to her eyes. Mrs. Leabody succeeded in finding reverse, and moved the lever into it. She tentatively put her right foot forward and found that it now reached the accelerator without any difficulty. She backed a few yards and changed seats again. Polly drove them back to the vicarage, in silence. At Kyle Manor, we were still having difficulty with the chief constable. "But," he protested from under corrugated brows, "our information supports your original statement that the villagers were marching on the Grange to burn the place." "So they were," agreed Zellaby. "But you also say, and Colonel Westcott agrees, that the children at the Grange were the real culprits. They provoked it." "That's true," Bernard agreed, "but I'm afraid there's nothing we can do about that." "No evidence, you mean? Well, finding evidence is our job." "I don't mean no evidence. I mean no imputability under the law." "Look," said the chief constable with conscientious patience, 4 people have been killed. I repeat, killed. 13 are in hospital. A number more have been badly knocked about. It's not the sort of thing we can just say, "What a pity," about and leave it at that. We have to bring the whole thing into the open, decide where responsibility lies, and draw up charges. You must see that. "These are very unusual children," Bernard began. I know. Lot of wrong-side-of-the-blanket stuff in these parts. Old Bodger told me about it when I took over. Not quite firing on all cylinders, either. Special school for them, and so on." Bernard repressed a sigh. "Sir John, it's not that they are backward. The special school was opened because they are different. They are morally responsible for last night's trouble, but that isn't the same as being legally responsible. There's nothing you can charge them with." "Minors can be charged, or somebody responsible for them can. You're not going to tell me that a gang of 9-year-olds can somehow, though I'm blessed if I can see how, promote a riot in which people get killed, and then just get away with it scot-free. It's fantastic!" "But I've pointed out several times that these children are different. Their years have no relevance, except insofar as they are children, which may mean that they are crueler in their acts than in their intentions. The law cannot touch them, and my department doesn't want them publicized." "Ridiculous," retorted the chief constable. "I've heard of those fancy schools. Children mustn't be, frustrated. Self-expression, co-education, wholemeal bread, and all the rest of it. Damn nonsense. More frustrated by being different about things than they would be if they were normal. But if some departments think that because a school of that kind happens to be a government-run institution, the children there are in a different position as regards the law and can be uninhibited as they like, well, they'll soon learn differently." Zellaby and Bernard exchanged hopeless glances. Bernard decided to try once more. "These children, Sir John, have strong willpower. Quite remarkably strong. Strong enough, when they exert it, to be considered a form of duress. Now the law has not, so far, encountered this particular form of duress. Consequently, having no knowledge of it, it cannot recognize it. Since, therefore, the form of duress has no legal existence, the children cannot, in law, be said to be capable of exerting it. Therefore, in the eyes of the law, the crimes attributed by popular opinion to its exercise must, A, never have taken place at all, or B, be attributable to other persons or means. There cannot, within the knowledge of the law, be any connection between the children and their crimes." "Except that they did 'em. Or so you all tell me," said Sir John. "As far as the law is concerned, they've done nothing at all. And what is more, if you could find a formula to charge them under, you'd not get anywhere. They would bring this duress to bear on your officers. You can neither arrest them nor hold them if you try to." "Oh, well, leave those finer points to the lawyer fellows. That's their job. All we need is enough evidence to justify a warrant," the chief constable assured him. Zellaby gazed with innocent thoughtfulness at a corner of the ceiling. Bernard had the withdrawn air of a man who might be counting 10, not too quickly. I found myself troubled by a slight cough. "This schoolmaster fellow at the Grange, what's his name? Torrance?" the chief constable went on. "Director of the place.
He must hold the official responsibility for these children, if anyone does. Saw the chap last night. Struck me as evasive. Everybody round here is evasive, of course. He studiedly met no eye. But he definitely wasn't helpful. Dr. Torrance is an eminent psychiatrist, rather than a schoolmaster, Bernard explained. I think he may be in considerable doubt as to his right course in the matter until he can take advice. Psychiatrist, repeated Sir John suspiciously. I thought you said this is not a place for backward children. It isn't, Bernard repeated, patiently. Don't see what he has to be doubtful about. Nothing doubtful about the truth, is there? That's all you've got to tell when the police make inquiries. If you don't, you're in for trouble. And so you ought to be. It's not quite as simple as that, Bernard responded. He may not have felt himself at liberty to disclose some aspects of his work. I think that if you will let me come along with you and see him again, he might be more willing to talk, and much better able to explain the situation than I am. He got to his feet as he finished. The rest of us rose too. The Chief Constable's leave-taking was gruff. There was a barely perceptible flicker to Bernard's right eye as he said au revoir to the rest of us, and escorted him out of the room. Celebi collapsed into an easy chair and sighed deeply. He searched absent-mindedly for his cigarette case. "I've not met Dr. Torrance," I said, "but I already feel quite sorry for him."
"Unnecessary," said Celebi. "Colonel Westcott's discretion has been irritating, but passive. Torrance's has always had an aggressive quality. If he has now got to make the situation lucid enough for Sir John, it's simply poetic justice. But what interests me more at the moment is your Colonel Westcott's attitude. The barrier there is down quite a bit. If he could have got as far as a mutually understandable vocabulary with Sir John, I do believe he might have told us all something. I wonder why. This seems to me just the kind of situation that he's been trying so hard to avoid all along. The Midwich bag is now very nearly too small for the cat. Why, then, doesn't he appear more concerned?" He lapsed into a reverie, tattooing gently on the chair arm.
Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe to hear more great stories.